Welcome to the second session of this unit. Principle. A contract which is duly supported by real and lawful consideration is valid, notwithstanding the fact that the consideration is inadequate. The quantum of consideration is for the parties to decide at the time of making a contract and not for the courts to decide when the contract is sought to be enforced. An agreement to which the consent of the promisor is freely given is not void merely because the consideration is inadequate. But the inadequacy of the consideration may be taken into account by the court in determining the question whether the consent of the promisor was freely given. Facts. A agrees to sell his mobile phone worth rupees 20,000 for rupees 100 only to B. A's consent is freely given. Which of the following derivations is correct? A. There is a contract between A and B. B. There is no contract between A and B because consideration is not adequate. C. There is no contract between A and B because a mobile phone worth rupees 20,000 cannot be sold for just rupees 100. Or D. None of the above. What are the conditions here? There are two conditions mentioned. First, that free consent and real and lawful consideration are necessary conditions for a valid contract. Adequacy of consideration is not relevant to this conclusion. The circuit would look something like this. Adequacy of consideration, as you can see, is not connected to the conclusion that the contract is valid. Now let's apply the facts to the condition. Has consent been freely given? The answer is yes, it is very clear. Is the consideration real and lawful? 100 rupees is real consideration. We are also not aware of any law against paying rupees 100 for a phone, so the answer is yes. Then the conclusion follows that provided all the other conditions of a valid contract have been satisfied, there is a valid contract between A and B. The question of adequacy is irrelevant. Now let's look at the options. Clearly, B and C are wrong because they rely on the adequacy of consideration. A is closest to our conclusion, and that is the answer. See how a complicated-looking principle became very simple once it was broken down? That's the crucial first step. If you are able to break the principle down into conditions, then the remaining steps become very easy. Let's practice with another question. This time, let's do it without visualizing using switches and bulbs. Principle. Vicarious liability is the liability of the master or principal for the tort committed by his servant or agent, provided the tort is committed in the course of employment. The master or principal is not liable for private wrongs of the servant or agent. Facts. X hands over some cash money at his house to Y, who is his, X's, neighbor and is also cashier in a bank, to be deposited in A's account in the bank. Instead of depositing the money, Y misappropriates it. Which of the following statements depicts correct legal position in this given situation? A. The bank would not be liable because Y did not do any wrong in the course of his employment. B. The bank would be vicariously liable because Y was the employee of the bank. C. The bank would not be liable because Y did not do any wrong. Or D. The bank would be liable because Y acted as bank's agent. Okay, let's do the crucial first step. Read the principle carefully and ask, what are the conditions? This principle can be restated as, if a tort is committed by a servant or agent during the course of his employment, then we can conclude that the master is vicariously liable. This is actually two conditions. One, whether a servant or agent committed a wrong, and two, whether that wrong was committed in the course of employment. What is the relationship between them? The word provided in the principle means that both conditions are necessary. Only if both are satisfied can we conclude that the master is vicariously liable? Let's apply the facts. First condition, was a tort committed by a servant or agent? The answer is yes. The question is very clear that Y is cashier in a bank, so he is a servant or agent of the bank. He also misappropriated money, so he has committed a tort. The second condition, was the tort committed in the course of employment? To answer this question, we need to ask ourselves, what is the course of a cashier's employment? Have you ever seen or heard of a cashier who works from his or her house? Didn't think so. A cashier's responsibilities are performed quite clearly during the office hours of a bank at the bank. So was this tort committed in the course of Y's employment? The answer has to be no. And so, because only one of the conditions has been satisfied, the conclusion has to be the master or principal, in this case the bank, is not liable. Now look at the options to see which one is closest to our conclusion that the bank is not liable. And the answer is A. The bank would not be liable because Y did not do any wrong in the course of his employment. That wasn't too difficult. We answered that question without having to resort to circuits. All we did was read the principle carefully to understand the conditions and how those conditions were related to each other and to the conclusion. Once we did that, we read the facts carefully to see whether those conditions were satisfied. After that, the answer made itself pretty obvious. Let's keep practicing. The principle is, in a civil action for defamation, truth of the defamatory matter is an absolute defense. However, the burden of proving truth is on the defendant, and he is liable if he does not successfully discharge the burden. Facts. D, who was the editor of a local weekly, published a series of articles mentioning that P, who was a government servant, issued false certificates, accepted bribe, adopted corrupt and illegal means to mint money, and was a mischief monger. P brought a civil action against D, who could not prove the facts published by him. Under the circumstances, which of the following derivations is correct? A. D would be liable since he could not prove the facts published by him. B. D would not be liable as such an action could curtail the right of expression and speech of press. C. D would not be liable as media could publish anything. D. None of the above. What are the conditions? Let's read the principle carefully. Since proof of the truth of defamatory matter is a defense, the principle can be rewritten as, if the defendant can prove the truth of the defamatory matter, then the defendant is not liable. This means that whatever the other conditions, if the defendant can prove the truth of defamatory matter, is a necessary condition. How is the condition related to the conclusion? If the answer is yes, then we can necessarily conclude that the defendant is not liable. Let's apply the facts. Was D, the defendant, able to prove the truth of defamatory matter? No. So we cannot conclude that D is not liable for defamation. Now, let's look at the options. B and C arrive at the conclusion that D is not liable. They are wrong because we cannot conclude that D is not liable. What about A, which concludes that D is liable? Is D liable? We were unable to conclude that D is not liable. Is that the same as saying that D is liable? The answer is, we do not know enough from the principle and the facts to conclude whether D is liable. The question does not give us enough information about whether the plaintiff has been able to prove defamation. And not being able to conclude from the principle and the facts that D is not liable is not the same thing as saying that D is liable. So that's wrong too. The answer then is D, none of the above. Let's move to another question. Principle. A gift comprising both existing and future property is void as to the latter. Facts. X has a house which is owned by him. He contracted to purchase a plot of land adjacent to the house, but the sale of the plot of land in his favor is yet to be completed. He makes a gift of both the properties, house and land, to Y. Under the aforementioned circumstances, which of the following derivations is correct? A. Gift of both the properties is valid. B. Gift of both the properties is void. C. Gift of house is void, but the gift of the plot of land is valid. D. Gift of house is valid, but the gift of the plot of land is void. So let's start by breaking the principle down. What's the condition? If a gift contains both current and future property, that's the condition. How is it related to the conclusion? If the answer to if a gift contains both current and future property is yes, then we can conclude that the gift is void as to the future property. Let's apply the facts. Does the gift contain current and future property? The answer is yes. There is the house that belongs to X and the plot of land that is not yet owned by X. The plot of land is future property. The house is current property. What's our conclusion? The conclusion follows that the gift is void as to the plot of land. Let's choose from the options now. Option D, gift of house is valid but the gift of the plot of land is void, is the closest to our conclusion and should be our answer. Let's try another question. Principle. The transferor of goods cannot pass a better title than what he himself possesses. Facts. X sells a stolen bike to Y. Y buys it in good faith. And with that, we have come to the end of the second session of this unit. Continue learning with the next video.